My name is Autumn Osal, and I'm a sophomore undergrad at Rutgers University. I major in plant science and ecology, evolution, and natural resources, which is just a big title for I study trees, right? Anyway, I'll be introducing Dr. Jason Grabowski, who, interestingly enough, is a product of Dr. Nina Bassick in her graduate program. So this will be a really fascinating talk. He'll be speaking about water literate and tree planting design. So fascinating stuff. He's a professor at Rutgers University for the Urban Forestry Department, so he teaches classes like silviculture, urban forestry, arboriculture, dendrology, all fun classes. He's a dedicated professor to his teachings, whether it's in a classroom or outside. Literally falls through a bridge, gets stung by bees, all in a matter of 30 minutes just to teach us fools. So he's part of the John Kuzer Faculty Scholar, and he really likes pecan pies, so if you want to go to his good side, buy him pies, lots of it, right? Right. Very, very known for having a really big stick. You ever want to find him, find a big stick at a guy that laughs like, oh. So, don't want to spend too much on his stage, so without further ado, Dr. Grabowski.
Howdy, folks. I think I can hold it back here, right? I don't have to talk here. I can go back here. Well, it's good to be up here. It's good to see a really full room. Welcome back. Isn't it great? It's kind of nice. So we're going to be talking a little bit about water today. We have a little bit of time, so if you've got some questions, either hold them to the end, or if it's something really, really important, wave your hand, and we'll see if we can't take it. But you'll have to speak very loud so people can hear you in the room. Okay, we all good with that? I'm also vamping while people come in, so we're all good. So again, I'm Jason Grabowski. I work for your land-grant university, Rutgers University, the State University of New Jersey. I'm also part of the Agricultural Experiment Station, and so I do some extension with you folks. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about water. And we're going to talk only a little bit about data, but I'm putting this slide up because if you work for the state, if you work with federal dollars, the National Institute of Food and Agriculture that funds a lot of the research that we do as your land grant, they're asking that we put this slide up so that you know that we are an equal opportunity employer. And if you have a problem or if you have a grievance, we cannot improve unless people tell us that there's a problem. So please look at that website if you think that there's a problem, and feel free to report as needed. Let's see here. There we go. So let's get on to the meat of the discussion. So in the broadest of terms, when we look at where we live in New Jersey, if we look really east of the Appalachian Rib and north of Florida, and there are trees in Florida, they just happen to be mostly horizontal at this point after last storm. But the landscape typically reverts to a forest community assemblage because we have enough water. We have a lot of water. Now, we don't have a uniform forest over this entire area. Some areas get wiped out with winds, like a derecho. We could have pests come in. We have this nasty thing called fire that occasionally moves through the area. So there are disturbances, but left to its own devices, we have enough water, fresh water, so that we can have forests. That's what comes in. With climate change, what's happening is the nature of that forest community is changing. New Jersey's really fortunate. We do have some problems with our climate, but as far as the diversity of the species that we have and the species that we have currently, we have a lot of stability in the system. We're not changing the community as much as other areas, but the niche and the environment is changing quite a bit. So the trees you have today will be stressed. If the environment changes faster than a tree can grow to accommodate that change in environment, it will be stressed. Doesn't mean that the species is not a good species, but it means that where we choose our mother stocks, what we choose in a provenance in a landscape, we may have to think carefully about that. We all good with that? Anybody want to argue with that point? Good, because I'm not in the mood for a fight today. But we're here to talk about water, and water is really important because we use water in photosynthesis, right? We have water. We have something called carbon dioxide. We have a problem with carbon dioxide nowadays, right? We have plenty of it. We need sunlight. We have plenty of sunlight. That's not changing. And we go poof with a magical chemical called chlorophyll, maybe a couple of other pigments, and we capture that radiant energy into chemical energy. We lock the carbon. A lot of people, carbon's sexy right now. All right? But notice, dead trees do not sequester carbon. And you can't lock the carbon unless you have water. If we're going to do our job, we have to stop marketing carbon long enough to remember that if you understand water, you understand the success and failure of your landscape. Not only do we use water in photosynthesis, we use it in transpiration, because you know what? We have a lot of sunlight. There's more energy hitting our trees than the trees can deal with. And so either you can cook your leaves on the tree, or you could do something like take liquid water, take the energy to move it to gaseous, and then move it out of the leaf in transportation. It takes a lot of energy to move water from a liquid to a gas. If you doubt that, put your hand on the stove after making a pot of tea and tell me if it's warm. It takes a lot of energy. So we use water not only as a fuel in photosynthesis, but we can kind of imagine water being the coolant and the radiator of that engine as well. We use a lot of water for a little bit of carbon. We manage our forests to bank that water. If you doubt that, look at any of the large reservoirs that are protected with forests managed to keep the water clean for New York City. If you doubt that, why do we manage the pinelands if not for water recharge of the Cohansey Aquifer? Water matters. And we manage the forests because people need water as much as anything else. We store the water. We have to think about banking the water now. And then we have to think about the cleaning capabilities of a forest assemblage so that the water we have is worth drinking. You don't get that by putting it through a concrete tube underneath the street in Hoboken. That doesn't clean it up much. Moving it through a viable soil, that can help quite a bit. When we think about trees, when we think about street trees, when we think about our park trees, it's really about soil, it's really about water, and we have this concept called the carrying capacity of the site. Up here on the upper left, we have lots of little sprigs growing up on the soil using the soil resources, and that soil can only hold so many seedlings. But as those seedlings get bigger, they use more material. So if I plant 1,256 seedlings in a community forest planting program, I should really expect maybe 30 or 40 of them left in 10 years, and they'll be using the same amount of resource. The ground can only hold so much. So one of our biggest problems right now is in the quest to plant more trees, because planting numbers of trees seems to be really good in a public relations campaign. Most of those trees are going to die, but the ones that remain are going to use just about the same amount of resource if we do our job well in management. And we can make the trees start behaving like aggregate organisms. That's Pando up there as a populous species. And this is considered a very large mega aggregate organism where the roots fuse underground. And we see this all the time. As trees grow, they start grafting their root systems if they're the same species. We see that all the time. And I'm sorry that I can't do both screens at once, so I'm going to go over here because this group needs to get some love too. And we see it when we do a thinning cut. If the root systems are integrated, what happens? The trees that are left behind, they grow really quickly. We call it accretion. We call it infill. And we have data that shows that this root system of the cut tree is still perfectly vital because it's connected to the ones that are left behind. So we're using the same site carrying capacity. When we lose things, other things are going to take up that resource. Nature hates a vacuum, right? It's driven by water. That was a good one. We'll try this one later. Okay, so when we start looking at this, I tend to look at these systems from a street tree supporting pavement to a forest. As goes your soil and your carrying capacity, so goes your plant community. And also the microbiology that's going on in the soil. Because we know in a forest we have a different microbiology system than we do in the plains or under grasses or in agricultural systems. Okay. As goes the soil, so goes that community. As goes that plant community, so goes your animal community, all your habitats for your insects, for your birds, for your animals. And there's a feedback back to the microorganisms as well. It's a system. When we look at root zones in tree management, we look at different typical types of root systems. And when we look at the shallow plate up on the top right, we can see that, and this happens to be a 1933 planting of Picea abies, Norway spruce. When we get high winds, they become fall down, go boom trees. And you can see the overweight, balding Polish guy with his Labrador Retriever, Finn the adventure dog. You know, we get really large root plates, but they're really, really thin if that's the soil they're growing on. The plant grows to its site. If you have a good soil, you plant a tree. If you have a damaged soil, you plant a seedling, and the seedling grows to the site. That's what Dr. Bassett was telling us. And the last thing, when we only plant those inch and a half sizes. They're cheaper to get. I can get volunteers planting smaller trees much more effectively, and they grow to the site. You come back 10 years later, you come back 5 years later, those smaller trees will be bigger than the bigger trees you plant. Gary Watson proved that in Indiana and in Illinois several times over. Different species have different root zones. But if I have a deep-rooting species on a really wet soil, I will get a pancake root system because roots need air and water in balance. Okay? So it's an important thing that we have to think about. If we lose that water, we're going to have problems. On the left, Dr. Ann Gould loans me these slides, or she did at one point, and so I'm just stealing them now without permission. You decide. But this is bacterial leaf scourge. The oak tree sets up its spring wood with really big vessels to move water really quickly. The bacteria grows in those pipes, in those vessels, and it's a population dynamics race. How fast does the bacteria grow versus the water flow in the pipe? And when you plug the pipe enough, the tree goes, starts scorching. That's how it plays the game. Of course, next year it puts out new pipes, and the race begins again. How many times do you get to go before the tree dies? That's the management race that we're playing. But we don't need bacteria. Anybody use road salt? Anybody have experience with road salt? You put enough salt on the ground, you can make a red maple look like the one on the right. Those are pictures that I've stolen from Dr. Bassick. I'm not sure she knows I did that, but I'm pretty sure she did it back in the 90s when we were playing together. Those are really old pictures. But the rule has not changed. Maybe our interpretation of the rule has changed. We can have too much water, and we can see too much water. If you want to kill a tree, better yet, if you want to kill your neighbor's tree, water it for them, because you can drown a tree more effectively than you can drought a tree. And if our climate change scenarios say that we're going to be getting more water, but we'll also have drought, you can drown a tree more effectively than you can drought a tree. We ought to think about that. The water doesn't have to come in a liquid form. It can come in a solid form. And we can tear a tree apart by loading with ice. Why would this matter? Because if we have later and later falls, with milder and milder falls, followed by a precipitous drop in temperature, for winter is coming. I don't know this. Nobody can predict this, but we ought to be thinking about ice storms. Because as the night follows the day, if you have trees with leaves late in the fall, with a rapid temperature drop, somebody's going to get hurt. I don't know where, I don't know when, but it's something we ought to be thinking about. And then, of course, the whole system can change. Here we've got Acadia National Park up here on the upper right. Notice that all of these are multi-stem trees because this was a competent forest until beavers plugged the water outlet, flooded the area, chewed out all the trees. When they blew out the beaver dams, you have multi-stem trees. They're all single trees. Those are all epicormic shoots of individual trees. But they're also root fused within their species, so they're large aggregate organisms. It's kind of like Hercules and the Hydra, but you have to have at least a good 12-year single malt in order to really see it. Okay, but it's there. Systems work on water. Systems are adapted to water. A parking lot outside of Sears is not a forest, but we still have the same equations in play as far as the surrounding environment. And we know things are changing. They're changing a lot. It's getting hotter. Photosynthesis is an endothermic reaction. You get warmer and warmer. Things have the ability to go a little bit faster and faster. More water is used in transpiration as you get higher temperatures because more water can be absorbed into the atmosphere in that hotter air. And the plant moves water out of the leaves in transpiration to keep a water barrier of high humidity around the leaf. Warmer temperatures mean you're going to use more water. It also means that your carrying capacity of the site is going to change because the demand for the resources are changing. So we need to provide more space than we're used to for an equivalent result. Does that make sense to everybody? We also know that we're going to get more water here. It's just that when it comes, it's going to come a little bit more periodically. So we're going to have dry periods. Well, no, I can't say that in mixed company, but really dry. We'll just say really dry periods, followed by really wet periods. And when we get our storms, they're probably going to be more intense. And probably they'll be associated with winds because with a higher air temperature, you get higher wind speeds and more defined frontal boundaries. So when the storm comes, oh boy, you better buckle down. And it also changes the paths of our tropical storms. So Sandy might not be so unusual to us in the future. I don't know that. I'm not sure the meteorologists know that yet. They were predicting a lousy fall season of color because of a summer drought, and we're having some really beautiful color right now. Okay? It's really hard for a meteorological chemist to tell you about how a tree turns color. and yet they feel they can jump their lane. Who knew? And so I keep looking for tree and water slides, and I'm not that good of a photographer, so I put a different slide in, but it has water in it at the bottom here. So we are still talking water. But the point being, water supplies are going to get to be stressed because our trees are going to be growing at a different rate based on the fact we have unlimited sun, we have unlimited carbon dioxide, we have more water, but do we have the space to hold the water so the tree can live? That's right, we're talking about design. I forgot that. So we'll get back to design, but when we have communities with combined sewer overflows, we have to really think about how we're changing the design of our stormwater management systems. And if we're going to have sea level rise, we are having sea level rise, a lot of our coastal communities are going to be marked by loss of real estate. We have people that are going to have to move. Where do they move to is a land disposition question we need to have as a state. But it also means if we're going to be moving we're a coastal population. If we're moving a lot of people, we have to build a lot of towns. We have an opportunity to do it right this time instead of in reaction like last time. As tree care professionals, as community members that talk to DPWs and mayors, as hopefully some political people in the room, we have to get this right. And we have to start asking better questions. It's not the number of trees we plant. It's the quality of the planting site so that what we plant actually lives. Otherwise, we're throwing away taxpayer money for shiny objects. Trees are not the point. The soil's the point because water's the point. It's really important. We've been talking about this for a long time. These are from, I think, 2004, 2005, where the federal government did a whole series of manuals on how we look at urban forest, community forest management planning, specifically for stormwater and watersheds. Forests work on a watershed basis. A 4x4 knockout in a sidewalk is not a watershed. And when we play that game, this is the only real data slide here. This is a simple little graph that a kid built. This is Bernie Isaacson's work, for those of you who know now Dr. Isaacson. This is a mensuration graphic with pitch pine. And I don't want you to read the slide. I just want to show you that people are working at this. Because we can look on the x-axis, the bottom of the chart is trees per acre going from 5, 10, 20, 100, 1,000, 2,000. Okay, trees per acre. If I go on the x-axis, this is really talking about the diameter of the trees on average in that plant community. And then we can develop a few other lines here. The blue lines are how much water is being moved out of that forest and how the water demand changes based on the density of your trees and the size of your trees. And if you have too many trees, like say pitch pine, on too small of a space, like say over the Cohansey Aquifer, the trees are going to get water stressed and call in an insect called, southern pine beetle, which is God's way of thinning the herd. And we change the structure of that canopy so we're moving towards a fire-prone situation, but it's a fire-dominated landscape anyways. We just don't let it burn the way we used to. Although the last big fire was really interesting because they were able to contain it in the broad sense because they had done a thinning of that canopy. And the thinning of that canopy changed the fire dynamics. It changed the insect dynamics because the water pressure was released. Same carrying capacity, fewer individuals. We brought the capacity back in balance. We put light on the forest floor, so many of our endangered plants and animals now have habitat that was lost because we stopped the disturbance cycle. So we get all these side things, but you know what the really big thing is? If I do this and if I just move the line by thinning, I could save 19 million gallons of water per year going into the aquifer. We drink that water. So sometimes we ought to think about forestry less about carbon. Oh my God, you're cutting a tree and we're trying to save carbon. Well, yeah, but dead trees don't sequester carbon. They die, and then they efflux it. And so if we look at this, the line that's letter A is if we do nothing, and notice the trees compete with each other, they kill themselves out anyways, and it's good for the insects too. Whereas if I do a thinning, line B, and I wait a few years, in the rebound, I'm going to end up at the same spot carbon-wise. But I'm much smarter water-wise, I'm much smarter fire-wise, and I'm providing habitat for things that don't have habitat that we want. It's not about logging. It's about systems analysis and what are our values. Something we ought to be thinking about. I like thinking about water. And we can look at water and carbon at the same time. We call that water use efficiency. And every different species of tree is going to play that game slightly differently. But it's about how much water is going out of the system versus how much carbon I'm locking in through photosynthesis. Water governs your community. If you understand water, you understand the success and failure of your landscape and your society. And water and access to it in the soil is going to determine the plant communities that succeed or fail in New Jersey in the future, as the night follows the day, because that's how it's always been. This is nothing new. I'm just trying to be a reminder. The tree canopy and its structure governs that water budget. Oh, and just to show you the bottom picture, that is Finn the Adventure Dog again, just to give you a sense of scale. Finn the Adventure Dog has been a very important part of my life since I had to take a break last year, and we got to know each other really well, Finn and I. But if you control water, you control your society. The lost city of Petra was a Las Vegas of its day because they built pipes and aqueducts and got water along a trade route where there was no water. And they locked the market. As a society, they locked it down. Until the dam broke and then they abandoned the city. Now, you know, those things happen. That's engineering. That's not biology. On the upper right, you have the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Really important cultural point where we proved we could do containerized plant production in municipal design. We also had this thing where they were worried about their contractors and people's housing collapsing under its own weight, and so this Hammurabi guy did something called codes and ordinances. Okay, we've been doing this a long time. It's just New Jersey lawyers elevated it. Let's say that right now. North American continent, outside of Canandaigua, New York, Ganadagan settlement, before European settlement, was using hollowed out logs of their local cedar species, Thuya occidentalis, and they piped the water into their walled settlements. They controlled water, they controlled their society within the multiple nations of the Iroquois with the Algonquin outside. We've been doing it a long time. What are we doing? We've been about conveyance of stored water to get it out of the way as a problem. But if we're going to change that script, if we're going to start thinking about water and trees, we have to capture that water, we have to stage that water somehow, and then we have to deploy that water. We have three pieces. You got to capture it, you got to stage it, you've got to deploy it. The picture on the right is a bridge over the River Yarra. It is a vault hung underneath the bridge with a continuous soil volume where they're managing the water of the bridge to stay on the bridge to become a water resource for the trees. That's Melbourne, Australia. Really cool system. The lower left, you've got a parking lot with a designed soil that's designed to hold up the vehicles with a grass surface so they can capture the water on the entire auto dealership's parking lot and move it out through transpiration of the turf. And they sell their tired inventory on the grass because people like walking on that grass and that cooler environment because of transpiration. And they can sell older cars for higher margins because the landscape is fit. Maybe landscaping has a value after all. Shouldn't be the end of the budget. It should be part of the budget. And we've been talking about this now since I had hair. We've called it water-sensitive urban design, WSUD. That's largely out of Australia, water-sensitive urban design. And you can actually get CAD drawings on how to do this downloadable. So your engineer doesn't even have to look for the boilerplate. You hand them the boilerplate. We call it in the U.S. often low-intensity design or, low-intensity design, LID, or low-impact design. We can call it green infrastructure, but I don't like that. You just need a good can of spray paint on a gray pipe, and you can make it green infrastructure. Okay, green's a color. Do we have competent design? And then, of course, there's the sponge city concept that's coming out of Japan and China. I mean, we're all doing this and we're all thinking this. As communities, how do we enable this? We don't become engineers, but we start asking our city planners, we start asking our engineers to talk about this stuff. This is what we value, so that we're inheriting competent systems with an ecological carrying capacity to grow the trees, or at least the willingness to get the backhoe to do the scoop and dump. I'll take that as a win. But you got to get somebody to do it, right? Because I don't know about you, I don't have a backhoe. All right? And thank the Lord that I graduated before she started doing the shovel thing. Okay. I would have gladly done it at the time, but boy, I dodged a bullet. Age does have its advantages. I put these books up. This is just what I found on water-sensitive design in about 15 seconds online. You don't have to go very far to find a lot of really good information to inform the conversation. And let's face it, Aaron Judge hit that home run. I'm not watching baseball anymore. That's done. Football, my team isn't having a good year. I know that already. I live at Rutgers, for God's sakes, all right? So I've got time on the weekends to do some reading. You probably do too. You can find this stuff very quickly. Now, in water-sensitive design, one of the governing prospects here is it's about water, obviously. This was Australia at the beginnings of a 500-year drought, and how are they keeping their cities alive? What they wanted to do is take the urban environment and change the watershed hydrograph. Remember forests grow in watersheds? They wanted to take the entire watershed hydrograph and return it to pre-development metrics as far as how long does it take for the raindrop to coalesce to peak flow in the streams? What's the volume and what's the timing? What's the hydrograph? And if I can compensate by moving the water through a little bit of soil, I can clean it enough that I'm not killing the population in the stream with any contaminants. And more importantly, I'm dropping the temperature down from the asphalt temperature to a moderated temperature so I don't have diatom crashes killing out the stream every time I get a major rain. Okay, so that's what we do. How do you do that? Well, forests, where the water lands, the water goes in the soil. In a city, it's more of a death of 1,000 cuts, and they're very carefully placed cuts. And I build little holes here. And in the top right, you can see that there's a side drain into the tree pit. And now the tree pit is just a quick sponge capturing the water, staging the water for drainage only. And the trees are a change-out prop because they don't provide enough soil volume for the tree biologically. They're just trying to get the water to move to a new hydrograph. Our proposal as tree people would be keep the water, let the tree move it, and I can change my energy budget, not just my water budget, but my energy budget by establishing canopy and intercepting that light. Not a hard push. And so they even took out occasional parking spots in the top left to put in a pit. And then going down the street in sheet flow, and you can see that on the lower left, I just keep diverting the water over and over and over again so it doesn't have time to concentrate. I keep interrupting the flow. If you talk to Dr. Chris Abrupta, the Water Resource Program at Rutgers, it's about interrupting flow and driving the water under the ground. Capture. Once it's captured, now you can stage it or you can use it. You can use it in deep drainage for an aquifer, or you can stage it so that you can use it for your vegetation management purposes. Trees use a lot of water. Here's a tree in New York City. This is Quercus bicolor. I think this is number 73 out of a group of 75 trees that we watch over the years. It's 25 years old post-transplant. It's a pretty good-sized tree. And you can go into iTree, and you can take a tree, put it in a landscape. It takes you about 30 minutes to do in iTree Design. And you can see how much that tree does for you as far as carbon, as far as air quality, as far as water. And in the modeled year, this tree is taking out just under 5,000 liters of water, intercepting that water in the rain and driving it down the surfaces of that tree. And you know what? That water can stay there, or it can go really close to the tree in the root zone and be used. It avoids over 1,000 liters of stormwater. That's the water that slides off the site. All right, you can model this, and it depends on your tree, it depends on the size of the tree, and you can model that out over 50 years. That's beautiful. But what it does not tell you is how much water is being used in photosynthesis and how much water is being used in transpiration. This is about water, remember? That plant, when we do gas exchange, I'm using 0.0002 units of carbon dioxide for every 1 unit of water. I use a lot more water than I'm capturing in carbon. Oh, a lot more. Carl Nicholas, in his book, Plant Biomechanics, at the bottom here, it takes almost 140 units of water for 1 unit of carbon on a chemical basis. Carbon's sexy, folks, but dead trees don't sequester carbon. We have to worry about water. Luckily, we have the water coming in, but we have to capture it and store it, and then we have to deploy it and get it into the ground. So if I'm a person tree-related, I'm going to say, well, Doc, that's great. How much soil do I need to have the carrying capacity for that tree? You know, you tell me I need to give it space. How much space? Well, Dr. Bassick came up with a model with Patricia Lindsay, basically for a deciduous tree in New Jersey, as long as the longest period of rain is 10 days between rainfall events, you need about 2 cubic feet of soil per square foot underneath the drip line. So if you want a big tree, calculate the drip line of that big tree. And where would we find that? The Durr Manual of Woody Landscape Plants. A good 20-year average size of a tree. Say, okay, this is how big of a tree? How much area underneath the drip line? That's how, double that cubic feet of soil. That's what I need. Now, if I don't have that space, if I put in irrigation, I can shrink that, but I can build a water budget off of this. So I can play that game. Baker did this in Holland back in the day by taking an entire forest water budget, consolidating it down to 1 tree, and then figuring out how much space that tree root system took. Okay, that's how he did it. Bassick and Lindsay went to nurseries and picked the leaves off the trees and looked at urban forms of the species with urban management in mind. So I still tend to go with the Bassick model, plus I'm biased. I mean, she was my mentor, and I think it works. Okay. I also think it works because Di Gaetano actually tried to tear apart the Bassick model and recalibrate it for irrigation scheduling of containerized city trees. And you know what? It held up. It's a good number. It's the best one we've got. If you want to improve it, I don't have a scholarship for you. But if I did, I'd gladly work with you. So how do we play with that? Well, we know how much water we might need. We also know how much soil volume we might need, so we can play that game. Here's the designed soil going underneath the parking lot. And the parking lot here is a 1 acre lot, so it's 10 blocks, 66 foot by 66 foot. And if I can design a soil, I have to deal with drainage. There's 3 parts to drainage. There's the sheet flow and infiltration. Then once it's in the ground, you got to move the water around in the ground laterally, and then there's deep drainage. You can't ignore any of those 3. You got to pay attention to all of them. And you can do that, and we did that. We had some fun, and this is a design soil that's roughly 82% stone and 18% soil. No, actually, it's probably more like 84% stone and 16% soil by weight. And we could model it. And what we found is that we can design a soil that can support a pavement if we can get the water in there. So what we do, and you can see on the far right, you could use a porous asphalt to drive the water in, or you could push the water into the mulch on the edge in sheet flow. It's just getting the water to the soil. I don't care how you do it, but you got to do it. And if we do that, we can start modeling parking lots. And if we start modeling parking lots, we find that that parking lot with a 3-inch rainstorm, which is minor now, but 3-inch rainstorm, if I can have the catchment underneath there 2 feet deep with a designed soil, I need about just under half of that parking lot in a specialized design. Now, it's going to cost you. But then again, having a livable environment might be worth investing in. I don't know. You make that argument. I could use plastic structures with a high capacity of storage, like 90+% storage. Then I may only need one of those blocks as a holding cell for water underneath the surface so I don't have mosquito habitats. But now I've captured the water and I've got a couple different ways of staging water. And then drainage, I can have deep drainage, I can have side drainage, and I've got infiltration. And so I can move the water to a panel of vegetation. If I know how to move water, I know how the success and failure of my landscape, I can build systems for vegetation advantage to take the water and keep it on that site, or at least delay it long enough that it's cleaned and going into a place where that water's fit for use. So we have the green with the tree, we got the brown with the soil, we got the blue with the water, and we've got gray infrastructure. If we design correctly, here we have McCarran Park on the upper right, 25 years old, and the trees in the pavement are the same size as the trees in the tree lawn opposite the street. So if you do design it, you can actually get normal tree growth in a city. But you got to pay for it up front. That's integrating with the soil design. Here's the plastic stuff. Storm tank, it's got over 90% voids. It's built like a bridging structure. And I drive the water underneath, and now I simply have to pump it back up to my green infrastructure. Just have to move it. Now, the interesting thing is they show turf There's a landscape architect in Boston. They were able to put berms on this and grow small trees and shrubs and make a zero runoff parking lot with deep drainage, with lateral flow, and the engineers signed off on it because it was designed for that. That's staging the water, connecting the water. If we're worried about sheet flows, we have the technology either in plastic cages or in designed soils to interrupt the flow as it moves across that parking lot, providing shade on that parking lot. I like that. You won't find it at Rutgers because we're putting solar panels up because I would rather capture my solar panel market without condemning agricultural soil. To me, that's a good loss. But I would want to make sure that to the north of that solar array, I've got my vegetation community. So let's not become overexcited about this. But there's a way and a place for us to use that water. And if we don't figure out how to use that water, we end up more like Petra than we do. What's a pretty place? Anybody got a pretty place? Where's your happy? The Adirondacks. It's going to look more like Petra than the Adirondacks to me. And we've been playing this a long time. If I know my plant biology, I can figure out the transpiration for different species of trees. I can schedule how many trees I need to dewater that parking lot. The engineer likes that because I can use numbers. I can design the system. I can intercept sheet flow for the water. And, again, this was with Nina. If you prepare the site, those trees grow better. The trees in the pavement are growing better than the trees on the sides in that landscape. And they're intercepting the sheet flow of water, driving it under and moving it down transpiration so that it's one of the nicest, coolest places on campus. And it's where they run all of the trucks for the Cornell bookstore. You know, this is a heavy traffic area. And we know how to make these numbers work, and they've been published in a book like the Rutledge Handbook of Urban Forestry. There's a lot of ways of doing this. Nina was talking about lifting these pads of concrete, putting a designed soil underneath so that trees have escape channels. You could do it with a conduit because engineers like conduits, because they understand conduits. You could direct the roots to conduit channels, move the trees underneath, grab other soil. Now you're building carrying capacity by layering your systems. We can either avoid the problem, we can integrate the problem, or we can layer the problem. And here we're layering one system through another system to the other side. Trees need access to soil. They need access to nutrients and water. We know how to model these numbers. We have that. We talked about that model. This is what it looks like. Small trees, small spaces. Medium trees, medium spaces. This is not rocket science, but if I can't go underneath, I can go up above. And if I only go up above with a small thing, if I water it, I can make this tree grow. Do I want to spend the money on that irrigation? That's up to you. Irrigation system, bigger tree, bigger soil volume, a seat wall, students sitting in the shade. Not hard to do. What doesn't work are tree pits. A 4x4x3 knockout is 48 cubic feet. That gives you a tree canopy of about 5.5 feet wide before that tree starts becoming water stressed. Doesn't kill the tree, but it's not going to do what you want it to do. And it sure as heck is not going to do what the landscape architect is marketing in the CAD rendering of the beautiful landscape. It's not going to happen. I could do a modified tree pit, 6x8, and let's be realistic, maybe only 2.5 foot deep. Okay, now I can get a 9-foot diameter canopy before I start worrying about water. Not a lot, is it? Think about what 9 foot is. That's almost like That's like 3 of me. You know, last year it would have been 4 of me, but right now it's 3. If we look at the model, Lindsay-Bassick method, if I have a 30-foot diameter crown, I'm going to need a panel 12 foot wide, 40 foot long, 3 foot deep. Or I need to provide irrigation. That's the space you're fighting for. It's a lot of space. Sometimes the tree doesn't belong there. But if that's the case, you better find a place where the tree does belong. Here is Midwest. This is Indiana. It's a new parking facility, a new landscape. On the lower right, you can see lighter concrete showing where the tree vault is. Notice that the trees in the pavement are actually smaller than the trees in the grass strip, and this is only a couple years after planting. It happens quickly. Both trees look pretty good to me, but what am I getting out of it? If I control water, I control the landscape. If I control volume, I control carrying capacity. Richard Leopold just finished his PhD, and here we have lawns, wide strips, narrow strips, and pits. And he looked at a lot of species. We're just modeling here Acer rubrum, and I have to point out there's a typo here, and this is why dissertations are ugly, because there's always at least one typo that you find after you publish the dissertation, and that's the one. Platanus X hispanica, Zelkova. What I want you to see is we have the site type, then we have the predicted age based on what he saw in the field with some modeling. And the red maple, we had a bit of a data issue in the lawns, but you can see the trajectory of the Zelkova and the plane tree. The more space you provide, the longer that tree tends to live, and the larger that tree tends to get. Dead trees don't sequester carbon. Your biomass goes up by providing more soil, and if biomass goes up, then you know that your carbon goes up. And we can model that. Here we have Acer rubrum spelled correctly. Okay. Notice that the pit, which is the lowest line, ends before all the rest of the lines. The trees grow about the same speed until they don't. There's little differences. They grow about the same speed until they don't. And the more space you give, the more volume. Y going up and down is canopy volume here. You get more volume. That's more leaves. That's more water use. That's more temperature modulation. That's more collecting dust out of the environment. So if you provide the space, you're going to get what you need. Here's a total leaf area. It looks a little different, but again, in the lawn, total leaf area tends to lag with Acer rubrum. It was right in line with the Hispanica and with the Serrata, but those trees lasted longer. They provided more service over a longer period of time. Remember, you move a lot of water for every gram of carbon you're locking here. It's about the water. So, if I'm going to do water literate design, I need to capture the water, stage the water, deploy the water. That means from an engineering stance, I have to capture it through sheet flow, and I have to use my soils information to hold that water in lateral flow and deep drainage. But in the end, I'm going to talk about how much those trees use. I'm modeling the tree I want, and that's going to take time because we're planting little trees. Don't want to show Bruce Lee yet. I'm planting little trees, but I'm modeling services of big trees. So you can't just plant trees. You have to plant shrubs. You've got to plant the ground covers. You've got to look at that because the engineering service of transpiration has to hit as close to day one as possible. As foresters, we have to stage the succession of the community to that canopy we want, just like we always have in forestry. You don't start with your end. You work toward the end. And we have to stop thinking just about trees. We've got to think about the entire plant community, because it's all the small stuff that's providing the service until we get the canopy that overarches and changes that budget, so it's the big stuff. And with that, because let's face it, we don't get enough Bruce Lee. And how many people would dare do it anyways? Okay, that's my talk. So now it's time for questions.
Thanks. For municipal planning, a lot of what you talked about, I don't want to insult our engineer, he's great, but I would think that there are people better prepared to jump into this type of project. Would you care to identify any of the terms you'd be looking for, or just water management and engineering specialists?
I think I would look at groups like Princeton Hydro that might suggest they have hydraulic engineers that are thinking about environmental services. I'm not advertising for them, but that comes to mind as far as gut response. I think almost any urban planner, any landscape architect, and I think that probably any highway engineer would be open to the idea of low impact development, because their credentials and their CEUs, they're getting hammered with this all the time. And it's a pretty easy sale because it makes the mayor look mayorly at a time when carbon and environment is really important. And they have the budgets, more so than the landscape. Does that answer your question, though? Okay. Anybody else? I don't know. How much time do I have, by the way? 1 more minute. Wait, we got one right behind you. How does salt play into this?
The parking lots.
Okay, parking lot salt in particular. It's bad. But let's think about it. What do you have to do? You probably have to rehydrate that salt and pulse it through the system. Okay, that's a deep watering. More often than not, that's going to do what you need to do. If I've got a pervious asphalt, every few years I may need to hydrovac it and pull some of the stuff out so I can get that rapid charge, because it's not the water volume, it's the speed of the water hitting the system, so you literally flush it. And I can do that as long as I can get the water in quickly. It will move through and it'll literally suck things down. Now, if the soil gets dry, I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to do it a second time, because the first time just gets it into solution, and it's the second flush that's going to take it out of the system. 9 times out of 10, it's not going to be that bad, because spring rains are going to do some of that flushing as long as you can capture the water and move it through. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Did everybody hear that over there? Okay. Yeah. And you know what? EPA has some of their best testing of that system and the numbers in Edison, New Jersey. Okay. And they found the exact same thing. And there's the government. They've got it. We know it works. What doesn't do well is turning your wheels on it. You want to try to keep people moving straight, because we do see some toe out of the asphalt if you're turning your wheels a lot. So where you deploy that asphalt, you may need to be a little bit strategic. Yes?
Just one last. You mentioned sharing of nutrients between grafted trees of same species. To your knowledge, will trees of different species or unlike species also share nutrients if grafted? Will they graft the root system?
That is a beautiful question, and the answer is it depends. Quite honestly, I'm not prepared to start talking about different species and the reliability of all the data and some of the inferences out there, but we do know if they're sharing mycorrhizal associations, you know, a good association is as good as a graft if it's moving through the processor of the mycorrhizal hyphae rather than the actual root of the tree, because the mycorrhizae gets through the root of the tree. So, but does that mean that different species are grafting? I don't think so. But I don't know that data, so I really don't want to go too far down that because I could give you really bad information. Are we done? We're done, folks.